Hi everyone, Tammy here. Welcome to my channel and a series that I'm calling Blythe Sewing Basics. Over the years, I have done quite a few videos related to sewing for Blythe dolls and also other dolls like my 18-inch dolls and my smart dolls. But I have to say, most of my comments are related to sewing for Blythe dolls. And in fact, I get quite a few people who say things like, I wish I could sew for dolls. I wish I could sew for my Blythe dolls. I would love to have you help me sew for my Blythe dolls. So while I do have quite a few videos on my channel already where I show myself sewing for various dolls, and quite a few including Blythe dolls, I thought it was time to get organized and create a series of short videos where I will chunk up information in each video and I will target beginning sewers. Now, if you already know how to sew, you're welcome to continue watching, and in fact, I would love to get your comments down below and let me know if there's anything I missed or you would like to add. I'm open to suggestions. So this video series, I'm really going to target the beginning sewer who has either no sewing experience at all or just a little bit. If this is describing you, then I recommend that you go ahead and subscribe to my channel now so you get notifications for future videos in this series. And I will have a playlist called Blythe Sewing Basics where all of the sewing basic videos are going to be housed. Let's get started with the first video in the series, and obviously the first thing that we have to talk about are the basic tools and supplies you are going to need. Now, I will have to admit, sewing means lots of tools. Just pretty much like any craft, there's like an endless list of tools and supplies you could possibly buy. So for this first video, I'm really going to concentrate on the things that I feel you must have. In another video, I'm going to talk about more specialized tools. So the first thing on my list to suggest is a pin cushion and pins. And in particular, I recommend getting quilter's pins. Quilter's pins are longer than your typical sewing pin, and it's been my experience sewing, no matter what I'm sewing, whether it's for dolls or otherwise, the longer pins just make it easier to pin things together. I also suggest, and this is you don't have to have this type of pin, but I recommend getting glass head pins, the type that have glass on the top versus plastic. That is because if you find yourself accidentally ironing over a pin when you're pressing, the glass won't melt where the plastic one will, and that'll melt the pin, and it could also stick to your iron. Along with regular head pins that you're going to use to pin items together before sewing, of course you're going to need some needles and also some safety pins. So you just need regular size safety pins. Usually you can buy these in assorted sizes, so you want some, you're dealing with small items when you're sewing for Blythe dolls. So little pins up to bigger pins, just buy the kind that have an assortment. You may even have some around your house, honestly. Most people have safety pins around the house. And then needles. And typically you're going to want needles that are around maybe a size 7 or 8. They can't be super huge, like for example, embroidery needles would be too large for most items. I also plan to have a video where I will talk about the difference between sewing by hand and sewing on a machine, but I will say you don't really need a sewing machine to get started. That said, if you do plan to sew by hand, you want to make sure you have some decent needles. So again, you can buy these in an assortment, but make sure you have some that are fairly small, because you need to be able to get into little areas and do things like if you want to add something small like a snap, you need the small needles to be able to get into those little holes in the snap. I actually keep a second pin cushion where I have some sewing needles and safety pins handy. Obviously, you're going to need an assortment of thread and fabric. I will do a separate video on that, but let me just say, look around. You might have some old shirts or some clothing that you were going to discard. So before you go out and spend a bunch of money on fabric, kind of look around in your closet, or if you have a Goodwill box that you've been loading up. Preferably, I would recommend cotton, and as far as thread goes, I would recommend just getting the general all-purpose thread that you would typically find available at most big box stores. Another item that I recommend getting is a fabric marking pin. So this is different than just a regular ballpoint pen, because this will actually disappear over time. This is super duper handy. This one I have, one side is purple and one side is blue. I will say the blue a lot of times is much lighter than the purple, so I recommend if you can get one that has both sides, blue or purple, you want to be able to mark something and see it. And I use this a lot for example, if I'm marking a seam allowance. A seam allowance is the measurement from the edge of the fabric over to where you're actually going to stitch, and I find this super handy for that. I will talk about seam allowances again in another video, but again, this is something that you could pick up at Amazon, and most big box stores that have basic sewing supplies will have something like this. All right, the next tools are kind of obvious. Some sewing scissors. I recommend getting a couple of pair, a big pair and a little pair. You can get other sizes, but at a minimum, I recommend getting a little pair, like a pair like this. Again, these are available in most sewing areas. These are handy for trimming off loose threads when you pull things off of your sewing machine, or even when you're hand stitching and you just want to have a little spot. These can be kind of cumbersome if you're talking about just trimming off threads here and there. This pair of scissors I have here are a pair of Ginger scissors. Say another brand that's probably very easy to find is a Fiskars brand. Most stores have Fiskars, at least in the US, and Amazon will have them as well. So they usually, the Fiskars scissors are not priced too terribly bad. I really like Ginger, that's a German company, and I adore these scissors, and they were totally worth it. And let me mention, when you get scissors for your sewing, do not use them for anything but sewing. Do not cut paper with them, nothing but fabric. Do not cut anything other than fabric with your scissors, okay? And that includes these. So these are good for fabric and threads only. Hide them from your family. Okay, obviously a tape measure, again, most available at most big box stores. And I will say also, double check AliExpress. I have had mixed results with some of the sewing supplies I have purchased from them, though, I will say, as far as quality goes. For example, I got these really cute pins from them, but they are crazy thick. And I just have them in my pin cushion because they're pretty. They're really not practical for pinning things together, I have found, unfortunately. But something like a tape measure, honestly, you can find these, again, Amazon, most big box stores. You'd be surprised. You might even find these at your grocery store, but you need to be able to measure items. And there are other types of rulers you can use, but for sure, a tape measure is the way to go. One side of the tape measure is in metric, and the other is in inches. Okay, finally, and we're almost at the end. Like I said, I will do a video where I talk about more specialized supplies, but at a minimum, you also need, believe it or not, an iron and an ironing board. Now I'm showing you my big honkin' iron. There are smaller irons out there that are super handy for dolls, but most people probably already have an iron around and an ironing board. So if you're just getting started, use what you have. I also recommend being able to have an iron that is either a steaming type of iron, or if you're like me and you don't want to put water in it all the time because then you forget it's in there, get a little spray bottle and you can just spray down your fabric and iron it that way and get the steam going. So this is really handy. It's an extra step that not a lot of people do, but I definitely recommend pressing as you sew. Of course, finally, you're going to need a doll. I know this is kind of weird, and obviously you probably have a Blythe doll if you're thinking about sewing for Blythe dolls, but you'd be surprised, some people, maybe they haven't purchased a Blythe doll yet and they want to go ahead and start sewing for one. Make sure you have one, and make sure you have one that has the body type that you plan to sew for, because there's quite a bit of difference between a doll like this, which has the traditional body type, and one of the fake dolls. So one of the fake dolls like I have here, this is Malibu, of course. She works in my dolly room as a model, and she's, you know, kind of my BFF. Okay, but you can just tell right away, there's a difference here in these two dolls' bodies, okay? This doll is quite a bit larger throughout the top area, and just in general, this doll is going to be bigger than this doll, okay? And that's something, again, I will talk about in future videos, because you have to really be careful when you're getting patterns. You want to make sure you have a pattern that's going to fit the doll that you plan to sew for. But it's really helpful while you're sewing to be able to try on the item that you're making to make sure it actually fits the doll before you're completely finished and find out, yikes, it doesn't fit, and now what do I do? So have a couple of dolls handy. This is a great excuse to buy a doll if you if you need to have a doll model, right? So go ahead and make sure that you have the type of doll you plan to sew for. I sew for both types, and so I have traditional dolls and then I have fakey style doll bodies. I hope you found this video helpful, and if you would like to find out more about how to sew for your Blythe doll, please make sure you subscribe, give this a thumbs up, and let me know what you think in the comments below. Have a wonderful Dolly Day. Bye-bye.